Hey, welcome everybody to this episode. Today we're going to be specifically talking about HTML. My name is Nathan.
My name is Taylor.
And this is Special Codes. Today we're going to be talking about HTML. We're going to be doing this in a two-part series, talking specifically first about introing HTML. And then the second episode, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into some specific things about HTML. But we have an expert-ish on HTML who's going to kind of get us going on our conversation, which is our awesome Taylor. I'm going to hand it off to you, man.
Well, thank you. I'm not the most knowledgeable on HTML, but you don't really need a lot of knowledge on HTML to be able to be proficient with it. It's a very easy language to learn, get all the basics down. HTML is basically the language of appearance. It determines what you see on a website when you go to one. Most websites nowadays pretty much use HTML. And anyone who's done web design or web coding or any of that is pretty good at it. And back in the day, if you had a MySpace account, you could use HTML code to edit that. It's a language that a lot of people know without necessarily being programmers. It's fairly easy, but the basic idea of HTML is just a display language. It determines everything that you see on a page. And the important thing to realize about HTML is that over time, it has evolved. So various versions of HTML do different things, or at least have different capabilities, I should say, not necessarily do different things. Modern browsers automatically know how to deal with HTML. It's pretty much inherent in everything. So you don't really have to download anything. And if you just want to code in HTML, it's as simple as going in and saying, this is HTML, and writing in that.
Does it automatically do the different versions?
A lot of that depends on your browser and what it's capable of doing. But most browsers nowadays, if there's a new version of HTML, will know what to do because everything is always updated all the time.
Nice. So my Windows 95.
Oh boy.
Yeah, so that was a different version though, so it might not be able to handle.
The browser that would use probably wouldn't handle a lot of things that we could do today.
So we're talking like visual kind of things, right? And when I was thinking about this, one of the things that came to mind was kind of like yearbooks a little bit, in the sense that like old school yearbooks and how people dressed and looked back then and how they look today, it wasn't necessarily a bad look. It was just a different look, right?
Right.
And it doesn't necessarily translate today.
No.
Like the way your parents dressed and acted and stuff, the way they looked on the outside is totally different than now. But it's
Right.
it's not necessarily bad or good, right? Or would you say that different versions, because you were talking about how they do different things. Can you talk a little bit about the versions?
I don't really want to get too far in depth because this isn't a tutorial, but I can give basic overviews. But just an example, and I'm not saying this is actually the case. I'm just using this as a visual example. Let's say you have a version of HTML that could display images. Let's just say this version of HTML can display images, but an older version of it can't. If you're using an old version and there's pictures on the page, you wouldn't be able to see them.
Okay. It just wouldn't be able to display the new image, right?
Right, and the format on your page could get a little wonky and goofed up.
Little funky. Maybe the lost in translation is an actual thing.
Mm-hmm. Oh boy, I could tell you a story about Internet Explorer 9.
I see. What does that mean?
So when I started programming and I had to use HTML and to build software, to build the user interface side of things, what the users see. And a lot of people this was in 2013. We had people still using Internet Explorer 6 that we had to account for. So that will just give you an idea. But Internet Explorer 9, I remember, was particularly troublesome because it gave us what I not so affectionately called the blank space gremlin, where if you had a space or a tab or something weird in your code, like you ended a line in your code and there was a space or a tab after that line, most browsers would ignore that, but Internet Explorer 9 decided it was going to do something with that.
Ooh! Let's play with this.
So that was fun because a lot of our code, you would just build your code and there'd be whatever after that, and you wouldn't necessarily care because things were working on your end of things, on most people's things, but somebody would pull up an IE9 and all of a sudden up is down and down is up and left is right and everything is skewed.
Those dirty, dirty coding gremlins, man.
I love that. I love that.
That's more on how the browser viewed things, not necessarily the HTML versions itself, but that can give you an idea of the differences in how things work.
So that's interesting that you bring that up, because as we were talking about the different types of browsers and kind of how the history of HTML has come, because it's a very visual one. It's interesting that you were working in 6, but 9, the newer one, was the issue. And so not always is the newest one going to have everything perfect, right?
Right.
And I think that's an important thing as we're going to move into this conversation, is recognizing that with our visual world that we live in, especially with coding, the newest, the greatest, the flashiest is not always the best, right?
Yeah. Sometimes it introduces new problems to deal with.
Which we don't know anything about that as people, right?
Oh, of course not.
But that also doesn't mean that the old one was perfect.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
There's always a reason for a new one. It doesn't just happen because.
Ooh, I feel like just appearing.
Now, I know people sometimes think people just put updates to cause problems, but they don't. That's typically not why people do updates.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because I think there becomes an insufficiency with the older version, or something is just not quite up to par. And so there is a need to do something about that. And so that need births something new, which in that birthing stage is not always better. And even sometimes would you say that Internet Explorer, just using that as an example, would you say that IE9, as you referred to it, which I caught, translation. So if you caught that in what he said, IE9 stands for Internet Explorer 9.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm still tech jargony.
No, it's okay. Some people are just like, boom, I got that. That's awesome. But in IE9, would you say that the issue with this, what you call it, blank space gremlin?
The blank space gremlin.
With the blank space gremlin, that it existed for the entirety of IE9? Or did they do some updates to fix that?
That was called IE10. And now it's Edge.
Oh, yeah. They just took the numbers away because they're like, we've made it to the power of 10. And if we go any further, binary is not going to be able to handle 12. We're pushing our limits with... Anyways, but I asked that to say, so in the entire lifespan of IE9, they never fixed that problem. And so a new version had to be birthed. Is that correct?
I can say insofar as I had to deal with IE9, they didn't fix it.
That's interesting.
So,
well, and I think that's an important thing, because I think that one of our conversations as we're moving into the introduction of HTML And with the mindset that it is a visual language, it helps us present ourselves and also interpret what is being presented. Would you say that's correct? It's kind of a twofold visual.
I would say so, yeah.
Right, because it's like how we are presenting information and how others are receiving that presented information.
It's what we're displaying to people and what they can see.
And I think this is really important because as we were getting into this conversation, we discovered kind of a really interesting connection with generational misinterpretations. And it's not necessarily because one generation is better than the other. I was actually just reading an article about different generations and their marriages in a magazine. It was really interesting to see statistically where things were higher in certain areas and how that affected people's view on marriage, and a need for an update of some sorts, and that update may or may not have worked as well. So that was an interesting correlation that they saw. So but how we appear in different generations is really interesting. Do you have any examples of maybe a generational misunderstanding that you've experienced?
In terms of programming or in terms of real life?
Yes. You may choose to interpret that question however you desire.
Well, okay, so we had a project. This has to do with HTML and viewing things. We had a project where we had to make a new feature for this client. So we made it, and we decided we would use these fancy new methods of doing things and made it all fancy and look pretty and nice. And then we tested it all and it all worked just fine. We shipped it off to the client. Well, they came back, said nothing worked, and it looked terrible because we were building it on new systems, HTML5. This was relatively recently. And like I said before, when I started, we had clients still on IE6, Internet Explorer 6, because what you have to understand is a lot of our client base is factory workers and factory floor machines that don't connect to the internet very often and aren't very updated. So things have to work on older things. So when we created this, when they tried to connect in and view it on their old machines, nothing worked. Because we were using HTML5 when we should have been using a few versions lower than that.
That's a great example of just kind of like, I think, this generational difference, because you and I think we're considered Generation X. I can't remember.
I'm on the edge between that and Millennial.
Yeah, me too. I'm kind of in the middle of this, but it's interesting because when we as human beings, and if we remember, the whole purpose for this podcast is not just to be a tech thing, like connecting these things to us as humans, is that when we make presentations, when we communicate with people, we really need to make sure that understanding happens with what we are trying to communicate and to whom we are. If I come to a baby boomer with all of these millennial ideas that are really great, there's a lot of opportunities for that to get misunderstood. I think one of the best ones that I hear all the time is, why are these millennials still living with their parents? Why can't they get a good paying job and get their own place and move out? And I sit there, and it's hard to have that conversation because a lot of times, like, it's for that generation, it's an expression of your lack of ability. Because you're living with your parents, you are not taking initiative. And I may not be correct. So in the comments, as you're listening to this, if you're part of that baby boomer or generation and you're sitting there like, no, maybe give us some insight in that too, because we might be naive in some of this. But maybe what are some of the things that you hear when somebody says, oh, I live with my parents still?
I think you are correct for certain areas. I think that's probably a Western US ideal from that time period, because you can look abroad at other nations and you see whole generations of families living in the same house, and that's just how it is. I think you are correct. Depending on the area you're in, there is a generational gap
Mhm.
where they will see that as failure. However, there is also a regional area cultural gap as well, where
Mm.
some will view that differently as well.
Well, and I think that's exactly what we're talking about with different versions, right? And when we see something like this, some people's instant reaction is to say that's an expression of irresponsibility and lack of motivation. And I honestly want to say, whoa, 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 whoa. That's a lost in communication situation, because it might be more economically smart for them to live with their parents. It might be more socially conducive because there's a relational thing there with that's connected to the family. Like, this is the lifestyle that we live at all together. I don't know. There's a lot of things that can be misunderstood when you just jump to this conclusion, irresponsible, right?
Yes. Doesn't necessarily mean that the person isn't irresponsible, but
Yes.
it doesn't automatically mean they are irresponsible.
Right. Well, and I think this goes to our translation conversation. It's like when code is presented in a certain form and it's received from a certain version, the instant reaction when that version is not updated is to present it a certain way. And one of our cautions as human beings is to say, whoa, 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 maybe I need to update something. Because we were talking about this idea of a new version and a needing a rebirth. I don't think that there's a rebirth for human beings in this sense. Like, ooh, look at me. I was version 6, but now I have upgraded, and we know some I have some people that I know that are of a different generation who have updated to millennial lifestyle, and it's kind of like 80-year-old wearing crop tops and all this stuff. That's like, whoa. We got a little misunderstanding going on here, because that visual also sends a message, right?
Yes.
And I think that rebirth doesn't necessarily have to happen with generations, but an update does. And that when we update something, it doesn't mean that we change the core of who we are. I do believe that there are times where we need to, like, just like what we talked about with our gates, is that we need to be checking those to make sure. But when it comes to also the way that we perceive the world around us and how we present ourselves, we need to be willing to update ourselves so that we can either present ourselves better to the people we are interacting with, or we need to update ourselves so that we can receive information better.
I would like to point out that while we are using HTML as sort of a jumping off point to talk about this thing, HTML isn't ever going to be a one-to-one perfect relational match to us as humans. Because
true.
while we can point to different versions of HTML as being better than the others, I don't think we can really do that with humans, because different versions, as we're talking about it in this context with humans and their ideals, might be perfectly suited for what they do or where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And our version might not be the one that's updated for them, and vice versa. So while we are talking about updating and doing all of this, I would also like to point out that that doesn't necessarily mean any one person has a superior version.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's really important because, like, when we first started off, you were talking about IE9. There was a big flaw there.
Yes.
And I would say each of our generations, there are some really big flaws that we have.
Yes.
I got issues, and I know all of the other people who are in my age group, we got some real big issues because of certain ideological changes that happen from one generation to the next. I think like for myself in that article I was reading about marriages is that Generation X had one of the highest groups of people who experienced divorce. My parents are divorced. And for me and for a lot of individuals in my age group, when it comes to relationships, there's this huge fear of putting our children through what we experienced. That's an I don't want that to be taken like all divorces were awful and all no. What I'm saying is that in my generation there were quite a lot of divorces. And so because of that, there are issues that we now are facing as we are growing into adulthood and in our own relationships. And it's not that the update that we had or the version that we're having was necessarily bad. And I don't necessarily want to say that divorce is not the right thing, because I know that there are some relationships where divorce was the thing that needed to happen.
Yes, I could tell stories, but
Right. And that's not what we're here to talk about. But what I want to say in that is that because of those experiences, we have our own set of issues. And that's the one that's most personal to me. That sticks out to me just because I've experienced that. But that doesn't mean that's the case for everybody. I mean, we have a lot of other issues, both good and bad, that are in our and the next generation, millennials, whether you're on the bridge of that too, they have some amazing things, but they also have some flaws. Like you said, one generation does not have a superior ideology. And I think that's important because as we're talking about this, I think an update does not mean a replacement of who we are. I really believe that that's so important because it doesn't mean that I have to become the new version.
sometimes you can apply a hot fix.
Yeah, and that hot fix is maybe not changing how I'm presenting myself, but it's how I'm receiving a presentation from people around me.
Hot fix is just a quick update to fix a bug.
Mm-hmm.
In case you were wondering, sorry, tech jargon again.
Thanks for the clarification.
And if we need to explain bug is just an error in the code or something that doesn't work.
Yeah, and that error, as we're talking about with people, is like just misunderstandings with communities or communication. And remember, specifically with HTML, we're talking about the visual things, the things that we see. And I think this is one that actually puts up so many barriers between generations and people. And I would even extend this to cultures. You brought the cultures in.
Yes.
I think that the way that we perceive things around us really puts barriers up, whether it's meant to or not. And we need to like update. I mean, man, talk about some of the most misunderstood things are all because of what we saw instantly we translate it in our own understanding.
Yep. Well, in Hitchhiker's Guide, an entire war was sparked because a wormhole opened and what Arthur Dent said got translated into a language he didn't even know.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's really important too, is like, well, okay, so for myself, I grew up in small towns. There's a certain ideology that happens with a small town in a community like that. You put me in San Francisco, I was dazed and confused the very first time I ever stepped into San Francisco. Talk about a world change for me. Oh my gosh, man. And honestly, talk about updates every 5 seconds. I was sitting there going, huh? It's like, if we're talking computer jargon, talk about crashing in the system. And I think that it's okay to experience those, but also at the same time, we need to make sure we do it in a safe way, right? Too much can really cause some very big problems. What would happen if something were to not update, but continually be presented with this new version? What would
All sorts of things would get scrambled. Going back to the project we did, We had to completely overhaul what we did to an older version. If we hadn't have done it, and we just kept going forward saying, no, you update, they would have dropped us because nothing would have ever worked for them.
Well, and I think like relationally, how does that translate? Like if we're talking about human beings, and we never see this happen, but how would that look with humans?
There's so many people are very strong-willed, and relationships, whether you like it or not, in some form or another, always have to involve a certain amount of compromise. I'm not saying completely change who you are or your principles, but there's always a give and take in a relationship between humans.
Right. And if one side's not willing to update
Doesn't
but
get
constantly
well.
well, I mean, like I can't tell you how many people. It's funny because we talk about this now, but let's talk specifically family relationships. I mean, those family get-togethers where people have not been willing to update their interpretation of the world around them. This is the best part of family get-togethers, right? What happens?
Oh boy.
Right?
Yeah, people argue and fight over some silly things.
Talk about something said and misunderstood and misinterpreted
Mhm.
and starting a war.
Yes.
I mean, it happens every Christmas between families. And if we would have taken the time to say, like, okay, I need some help updating, clarify this for me. Because what
Mhm.
I am seeing, and I think that's the biggest, the language we use when it comes to visual presentation is so important. It really has to do with who we are presenting ourselves to. Because if we visually come in with our own understanding of it and not being willing to meet in the middle, we already automatically put a wall up.
We do.
I mean, that's why internet browsers have firewalls to prevent information and things that might be. I don't know how firewalls necessarily work, but older versions might block certain things because they don't know how to deal with them.
Not necessarily blocking, just not do anything with it because I don't know what it is.
Right. Just like say, nope, not letting that come in. Sorry. And for some people, that might be taken as offensive. Whoa,
Yes.
whoa, 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 whoa. You're not accepting this? Excuse me.
Yep.
And it's not that they're not letting it come in necessarily. It's like they just don't have the ability to understand what is this? And we just have to be careful with that. And I think that's one
We
of the
do.
man, as people in this world, and as we're thinking technology wise and how this can help us grow, we really need to be careful. Too many people get hurt, relationships get blown up because we weren't willing to update ourselves.
Yeah. I would agree. I would also say that updating isn't necessarily, and I don't think should be, a one-way street either.
Yes.
If you ask somebody else to update, you might want to check to make sure you're updating as well, and vice versa.
Well, yeah, and I think like when we find updates and we do that, we're able to say, "Hey, I noticed this thing here is an error. So can I help you hot fix this really quick?" But I didn't recognize that needed hot fixed until I fixed myself. You're right. It's a two-way street. We become more human when we allow each other to help each other update. And I think that's the big part of this first conversation is as HTML, we need to be willing to update.
Be careful how we present ourselves.
Yeah, well,
and interpret how others present themselves to us.
right. If I walk into a retirement home with short shorts and a wife beater, nobody would talk to me. I would feel like they would really have a hard time understanding me unless they had family members that wore those clothes. It's all that visual.
Mm-hmm.
But likewise, I think a lot of our generation, we see an old person, or even my kids, they see an old person outside of our family and they don't know how to interact.
Yep.
And so it's a two-way street. We need to be willing to do this. Great.
Well, I just want to say one thing before we close it out.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever we look at the past and look at people and what version they were in, it's very easy to look at what they did and see where we are now and point out where they went wrong
Mm-hmm.
and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I would just like to leave everybody with this. We wouldn't be where we are at the version we were at without the previous versions.
Yeah. Or the sacrifices that they made, the decisions that they made,
Yes.
but for good or bad.
Yes.
I agree with that. And I think that we dishonor other generations that have come past when we just throw everything out.
Yes.
And by doing that, we say nothing good came from you. And that's just not true. We would not be the people, the culture that we are without them.
Exactly.
We need to be willing to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.